Dr. Marty Makary is a Johns Hopkins School of Medicine professor. He has published more than 300 scientific research articles. His book is called Blind Spots: When Medicine Gets It Wrong and What It Means to Our Health. In his preface, Dr. Makary says he realizes that much of what the public is told about health is medical dogma, an idea or practice given incontrovertible authority because someone decreed it to be true, based on a gut feeling. He writes, "This book may change your life. It did mine."
Do you know any social studies, media, or literature teachers in grades 6 through 12? Encourage them to participate in C-SPAN's Student Cam video documentary competition. With the upcoming November election, we're asking young people to address the theme, Your Message to the President. What issue is most important to you or your community? $100,000 in cash prizes will be awarded to students and teachers. To learn more, go to studentcam.org.
Dr. Marty Makary, this quote from your book: "The current reactionary, siloed, whack-a-mole healthcare system isn't working." Explain that.
Well, look, we've got the most medicated population in the history of the world. Chronic diseases are increasing. The promise of curing cancer and reducing chronic diseases is pretty apparent now. It's failed. We have half of our nation's children obese or overweight. We've got a quarter of them now taking medications or candidates for medications. 20% have prediabetes or diabetes, conditions that we thought were rare in children, like the fatty displacement of the liver, what we call steatohepatitis, is now common. And many chronic diseases in adulthood burden our healthcare system. It is a suffering problem in this country. It is a cost problem. It's a national security problem. People are not qualifying to join the military. Autism, for example, has increased 14% each year for the last 23 years. At no point is anyone asking the big question, why? What's going on? So we've got to look at our food supply. We've got to look at chemical ingredients we've added to the food supply, pesticides, the role of the microbiome in health. Many of these areas have been ignored and live in the blind spots of modern medicine because we've created a system where we've done a terrible thing to doctors. We've told them, put your head down and bill and code, and we're going to measure you by throughput. Trust me, I'm a doctor. I know this system well. And enough doctors are now saying, we're not going to do this anymore. We don't have the time or resources to deal with the root causes of disease. So we've got to move from this whack-a-mole system of treating sickness to finally addressing the root causes of health.
How do you do that?
Well, first of all, we have to realign our incentive structure. We do so much damage as a government actively to health. We subsidize the corn and soybean industry to make these products extremely cheap, making them ideal for processors to process these vegetables and then sell them with a misnomer like vegetable oil or canola oil or soybean or corn oil. These are not naturally occurring ingredients. I'm referring to the seed oils that we buy for very low prices. They take natural vegetables, they denature them, they heat them up, they give them a solvent, and they change their chemical structure. So when they go down the body's GI tract, they are different. The body's reacting to it. These are chemicals that do not appear in nature. And when they hit the GI system, the lymphatic system in the wall of the gastrointestinal tract is reacting. And it's not reacting with a big inflammatory response. It's reacting with a low-grade, low-level inflammatory response that's always there. It's chronic. And it's making our kids feel sick and sad sometimes. Some of these ingredients have been banned in Europe and Canada. As a matter of fact, Fruit Loops has two versions, one that the company makes for the United States and one that they make for Canada without some of these chemical additives because they're banned in Canada. So we need to recognize that we have poisoned our food supply. engineered highly addictive chemical ingredients, coated our food supply with pesticides that have hormonal-like binding properties. We've introduced high numbers of microplastics, and we're eating seed oils at a rate of about 10 to 20% of all our calories now come from these seed oils that are not seed oils. They are essentially chemical derivatives. We've got to take a step back and ask, what are we doing? We're watching all these chronic diseases go up. The age of puberty is going down each year. It's years earlier than it is in other countries or 2 generations ago now. Sperm counts have gone down 50% over the last 5 decades. And in my area of pancreatic disease, we have seen pancreatic cancer double in the last 2 decades. It's a pattern that is noted among the gastrointestinal cancers. That is, the cancers that line the GI tract. Well, what's going on in the GI tract? That's the front lines of where these chemicals are introduced into the body, and it's where the microbiome has been altered. That is, our gut health has been altered by these ultra-processed food chemicals and even unnecessary antibiotics and unnecessary C-sections.
Tell us what it would be like hanging around Dr. Marty Makary during a week. What do you do all week?
Well, I love my job. I've got a great opportunity to work with students, residents, and doctors at Johns Hopkins and around the country that are interested in the big topics in health and medicine that we are not talking about, that we need to talk about, the blind spots of modern medicine. And so our research is not funded by the NIH, it's funded by philanthropists and by the hospital. And what we do is we not only engage in the big issues that are not getting the attention they deserve, but we can have the liberty to think creatively and have big ideas and zoom out and look at our entire healthcare system and ask big questions. So that autonomy, our research meetings are amazing times where we throw around big ideas. That autonomy that we've had has enabled us to respond rapidly to health crises, something the NIH cannot do in their bureaucracy. It took them, on average, 6 months to fund a study on COVID during the COVID epidemic, just to appropriate the funds. Whereas when we had the opioid crisis hit, we immediately developed opioid guidelines within weeks. When COVID hit, we immediately started to look at the magnitude of the potential problem and began to warn the country. And when it came to some of the other topics in America's blind spots in healthcare, we were able to draw attention to a new problem in medicine, and that is price gouging and predatory billing by hospitals. This really violates the sacred oath that we take as physicians. Doctors don't ever want to take care of someone and treat their illness and then ruin their life financially. But that's what's going on given some of the billing practices that hospitals have adopted unbeknownst to physicians. So we have tried to increase hospital accountability, and we've also done the same with medical errors and patient safety and quality. So I love my job. We have research meetings. I get to travel and speak, write articles, write books. And so I love my job, and I couldn't design a better job.
How often do you deal with a patient that has pancreatic cancer?
I used to take care of pancreatic cancer 3 or 4 days a week in the operating room. Now, because my focus is on public health research, I probably spend 1 or 2 days a week in the clinical setting. 1 or 2 days a month in the clinical setting, and the rest of the time is allocated to research. It's good to have a hand in clinical medicine, not only to have camaraderie with America's doctors to understand what they have to deal with on a day-to-day basis, but it's where big ideas come from. It's from the bedside. It's from understanding from a macro level what's happening in healthcare and at a micro level.
You don't talk about it in your book, but I should ask you, well, I've got an expert on this, any way that pancreatic cancer is going to be cured at some point?
Well, we're going backwards. We're not going forward in understanding pancreatic cancer. I don't foresee any cure in the near future, sadly. The treatments today are very similar to what they were 22 years ago when I joined the faculty at Johns Hopkins and joined our pancreatic group. We do more pancreatic cancer at Johns Hopkins than any other hospital in the world. We treat more patients, we see more cases. And sadly, despite the fact that we have the best experts, great doctors who are my friends, at no point in those 22 years has anyone in our multidisciplinary group asked a big question: why has pancreatic cancer doubled in the last 2 decades? At no point are we given the time or resources to look at the root causes of some of these diseases. So instead, we have put doctors on a mission to put out fires in late stages of chronic diseases and cancer. And the system is not working. It's getting more expensive. We're not preventing some of these diseases. You know, I grew up in rural Pennsylvania in the coal mine region. And on the way to the mall when I was a young child, I noticed there was smoke coming out of the ground near the highway. My mom was driving. I was too young to drive. And I said, "Mom, what's that smoke coming out of the ground?" And she said, "Marty, that is the Centralia mine fire smoke. There's a mine, the coal mine that extends for miles and miles, and it's on fire, and it will continue to burn for hundreds of years. They can't put it out, and so it's emitting this smoke." Well, my dad, who was a hematologist at Geisinger, noticed a lot of rare cases of a certain kind of leukemia. And he was certain that the reason he saw them in such high proportion relative to other hematologists around the country was because of the Centralia mine fire emitting these toxins. Well, I assumed that somebody would put the pieces together, eventually address the mine fire, protect public safety, and prevent this from continuing. But as I entered medical school, I realized nobody is working on this. As I entered residency and entered a career in surgical oncology, I realized there's no center at the NIH working on this. As I embarked on research and a research career of my own after getting a degree in public health, I realized this is one of the many things in society that lives in the blind spots of modern society. That is, the environmental exposures that cause cancer, the ultra-processed foods that may cause cancer, the change and altering of the microbiome that may cause cancer is not something that gets a lot of attention. We don't talk about it. There's no reward for looking into these big issues. And it struck me that we are not asking the big questions that we need to be asking. And that's why I wrote this book, Blind Spots.
What do you think of Big Pharma?
Big Pharma has essentially captured American research. They've captured our regulatory bodies. They, look, medications save lives. And I'm grateful for many of the developers and scientists at Big Pharma. But the system now has a life of its own. Big Pharma has a hammerlock on academic medicine. Many academic research institutions are getting much or most of their funding from Big Pharma. Well, is Big Pharma interested in studying the Centralia mine fire toxins? Is Big Pharma interested in studying the alterations of the microbiome from ultra-processed foods and pesticides? Is Big Pharma interested in doing a clinical study to answer some of the techniques and procedures that we do in the operating room, including cutting the frenulum of the tongue of newborn babies, a practice that has become rampant despite the concerns of many surgeons that this is not good for children to be done on a routine basis? Who's going to do that research? And so we have this Bermuda Triangle of American healthcare research, where if Big Pharma is not interested, and one of the old school dinosaur departments at the NIH has not designated this something to be studied, then it doesn't get studied. And what does get studied are grants to fund studying bat coronaviruses in Wuhan, China, and cocaine experiments in Japanese quail. And so we have all this money that is spent on research that is misguided. Virus hunting, for example, Why are we sending people in Southeast Asia at other institutions to go find rare exotic viruses in caves and bring them to urban centers to describe them? There's 1 million viruses in the world. Why are we out there hunting them? Probably less than 1% have crossed over into the human species. So sometimes the research that we are spending our money on as a country is good and warranted and results in lives being saved. Sometimes it's a waste, and other times it's just supporting mad scientists who are doing things for the sake of doing them. So we need to reestablish our research priorities. I think people forget that the H in NIH stands for health, and the F in FDA stands for food. And these institutions do not belong to big food and big ag and pharma, as these companies often think it does. They belong to the American people.
How much of a revolving door is there in the medical industry that comes in government, FDA, NIH, and all that stuff, and then goes back out into industry?
There's a huge revolving door. And if you look at the food pyramid, for example, some of the biggest misinformation spread by the United States government has been the food pyramid and continues to be what they call now the food compass, which somehow concludes that Lucky Charms is healthier than a clean steak. And so we still have 90+% of people involved in food guidelines in the government. The advisors and experts have been paid or are paid by these big corporations. So there's a couple things we can do to actually make America healthy and address chronic diseases for the first time. And that is get rid of so many of these conflicts of interest, create restrictions on the revolving door, and stop subsidizing foods that make us sick. Why is one of the number one things bought with food stamps in the United States soda, sugary drinks? And at the same time, we have the government putting out misinformation saying that fat is bad for you, and they've ignored the role of sugar. We've got the American Heart Association somehow claiming that it's okay for kids to have 10 grams of sugar a day. Where did they get that from? They made it up, and they made it up with a long history of being closely tied to the money that big food has given them. So we can address these problems, and now there's a new interest and there's a newfound enthusiasm to finally address food as medicine and the food supply by focusing on childhood chronic diseases.
Do you have any examples or any evidence where a medical association or a medical group would make a decision on how much sugar somebody could eat and do it because where the money's coming from?
Well, when I was at the Harvard School of Public Health, the head of nutrition, this guy, Dr. Walter Willett, who wrote the textbook that was used worldwide, was extensively funded by the food industry. Now, he was teaching America's health professionals what was healthy and what was not healthy. I gave the keynote speech at the big dietitian and nutritionist conference, the big conference that's held each year. And after my keynote speech, somebody took issue with some of the things that I said because I like to push the field of medicine. And it turns out it was a lobbyist, a representative from the Milk Association. I find out that the Milk Association is one of the two biggest sponsors of that nutrition conference, training America's nutritionists. And the other big sponsor was Coca-Cola. Now, what I had said is the purpose of science is to challenge deeply held assumptions. That includes the assumption that every American adult and child should drink 3 glasses of cow's milk a day. Where did that come from? And yet that still remains dogma today. Dogma can do a lot of damage. Dogma created the opioid crisis through the dictum that opioids were not addictive. Dogma created the modern day peanut allergy epidemic through the bad guidance that parents should avoid peanut butter for kids 0 through 3 years of age in order to prevent peanut allergies. Turns out they got it perfectly backwards. If you don't know something as a doctor, you're supposed to say, I don't know. But we see that lack of humility from our small oligarchy, the priesthood of physicians who are at the top of the medical establishment. And when they use good scientific research, we shine. We can help a lot of people in medicine. But when they go with their gut feeling, when they rule by opinion, they can do a lot of damage.
Why does Dr. Makary know more about peanuts than the American Academy of Pediatrics?
Well, in the book Blind Spots, I went back to some of the people who made the recommendation in the year 2000 for all young children 0 through 3 years of age to avoid peanut butter or peanut products if they were considered to be high risk, and high risk was very nebulously defined. It turned into a dogma on the ground in every most pediatrician offices to say, hey, mom, remember 1, 2, 3. At age 1, you can introduce a little milk. At age 2, a little eggs. And at age 3, a little peanut or peanut butter. Well, that resulted in this modern-day peanut allergy epidemic that has become so severe. Peanuts have been banned in schools because we have a new type of allergy, and it's uniquely American. You don't see this. You don't see peanut allergies in Africa or many parts of Europe. But because of this dogma, we ignited this modern-day peanut allergy epidemic. When I asked the people who made the recommendation, hey, what were you thinking? And do you feel bad about it? I heard, well, the public wanted to know what they could do to prevent peanut allergies, even though peanut allergies were rare and mild. So we had to tell them something. And I said, no, you didn't. You don't have to say something. If you don't know, you don't have to tell them what to, you don't have to hedge your bet and, take a gander at it. And so one of them told me they wanted to be consistent with a newsletter that had gone out prior that suggested peanut avoidance for young kids. So they wanted to just, in the name of being consistent, hold on to that. Others just said, it made sense. It was logical. But they ignored an entire body of literature from the immunology community that had described for many years the concept of immune tolerance, or as what parents had known as the dirt theory. If you're exposed to allergens early in life, your immune system will learn those allergens and be less likely to react against them. But they ignored this body of literature, and they didn't do the study they could have done before issuing the recommendation. So it's tragic. It's an example of groupthink. There's a lot of groupthink in medicine. Eventually, 15 years later, after this catastrophic broad recommendation that ignited the modern-day peanut allergy epidemic, about 8 years ago, a doctor in the UK published a trial showing that, comparing both approaches and showing that if you introduce a little peanut butter at age 5 months, 6 months, early in infancy, as soon as a kid can eat, then the child is far less likely to have a peanut allergy later in life, 8-fold different. That study should have been done before they issued the broad dogma. The worst thing you can do in medicine is to have just a hunch of an opinion and then put it out there with such absolutism. And that is the derivative of the mistrust that we see in public health today.
I'm not sure how you pronounce it, but Dr. Festinger or Festinger?
Yes, Leon Festinger.
You mentioned him with praise, but you also mentioned the fact that he had a theory of cognitive dissonance in medicine. Explain that.
Well, it's not just in science, it's in politics and in business and management decisions. This idea that we believe what we hear first, not because it's more logical or more scientific than new information, but Dr. Festinger was a psychologist who described this very well. He said, the brain is subconsciously lazy. it holds on and clings to its first belief system on a certain topic. So if new information comes in that contradicts your belief, it becomes subconsciously very uncomfortable. It experiences cognitive discomfort or dissonance, and it will reject new information or reframe it to fit what you already believe, just in order to preserve what you heard first. And we see that in so many aspects of society, in politics and in medicine. We had the low-fat diet ingrained in us. It was beat into us. My father, who's a physician, it was beat into him for 60 years. So it's very hard for him to recognize this dissonance. And so the father of modern medicine, Claude Bernard, basically said, we all have our biases. We need to recognize our biases and then temporarily suspend them as we hear new information in order to be impeccably objective. And one of my hopes is that the book Blind Spots will be a bit of a guidebook on how people can become impeccably objective. Because people who are impeccably objective are more affable. They're more successful in life. And also they're more likely to discover something new in science.
Where did the Makary family originate?
My family's from Egypt, and I never lived there. I was born in England, but my family is originally from Egypt.
And why did your father, your whole family, come to the United States?
There was a concern that Egypt was going down the road of communism under President Nasser at the time. Things were getting more tense in the Middle East, and so my father, who was a physician, had wanted to do some subspecialty training, and so he went to England at a hospital where they invited him to do some additional training.
What year did he come here?
In the early 1970s, we came to the United States. I was young, and we came to Johns Hopkins, where my father did some additional training. And then we settled in central Pennsylvania in the coal mine region, which is where I grew up my entire childhood.
Where did you go to undergrad, and where did you go to medical college?
I went to undergrad locally. I'm very close with my family, and so I went to a college 15 minutes down the street, a college called Bucknell. And then I enrolled in Thomas Jefferson Medical School. The year that I applied, Thomas Jefferson was ranked the #1 school in the country for primary care. I thought I was going to be a missionary doctor, and so I enrolled there. After 3 years of medical school, though, I felt disillusioned by medicine. I felt that we're not dealing with the root causes of problems, and I had no interest in playing the whack-a-mole game and being a part of this hamster wheel of billing and coding and being measured by throughput. So I left medical school and enrolled at the Harvard School of Public Health and studied what continues to be my life passion, and that is the root causes of disease and sickness and the preventability of many of our modern day health problems. And so research became my passion. I took courses in biostatistics and epidemiology. Eventually, I missed the bedside care. I missed the art of being a doctor. And with the encouragement of my father, finished my medical school training, got the degree, and enrolled in surgical residency at Georgetown, and then did a subspecialty training in surgical oncology and gastrointestinal surgery at Johns Hopkins, where I stayed on the faculty and have been focusing on research for the last 7 or 8 years with the vast majority of my time.
One small thing that you talk about in your book that I'd love to get you to talk about here is the idea that a doctor in residency or an internship would work 36 straight hours.
Yeah. Look, it's inhumane. And there is a cycle perpetuating the abuse. It's a cycle of abuse. And it was in one of the blind spots of medicine. People had the idea that I went through it, so therefore you can go through it. But working 36 straight hours, or sometimes even over 48 straight hours, and I've done that numerous times in my residency, you're functioning like you're intoxicated with alcohol. We made mistakes. We had a general feeling that it was wrong, but it was the system we had no control over. We had no voice. Eventually, the system did reform itself, but it took a long time, and many people were sadly hurt along the way and injured in a way that was entirely preventable.
And so, any change anywhere in the system yet about the 36 hours?
So 36 hours routinely are no longer allowed to be scheduled by the accrediting body. However, people do work overnight shifts, 24 straight hours. And so there are still, I think, opportunities to make residency education safer for patients and more humane for the residents. But I think the bigger issue is that we are not educating residents and students to be great doctors. We are educating them to help us achieve the throughput goal of hospitals. We are also stuck in a dinosaur age of medical education, where every medical school curriculum is controlled by one private company that has a monopoly. And that one company, called the AAMC, the American Association of Medical Colleges, they have a board, which hopefully this new board is going to be better, but they write the exams and every medical school teaches for the exam. So that's why we have a broken medical school education in this country, producing doctors that are robots because they're forced to memorize and regurgitate thousands of names of medications and molecules that you can look up. And why does a medical student need to memorize the Krebs cycle at 4 different points in their education? I'm not talking about the process of the Krebs cycle or what it's doing. I'm talking about the names of each of the intermediate molecules. You never need to know that in the hospital. And so when we create this memorize and regurgitate education, we're ignoring these giant areas of health in the blind spots of modern medicine: food, nutrition, the microbiome, the role of pesticides, microplastics, seed oils, environmental exposures that cause cancer. All of these giant blind spots exist as we create this reflex in young medical students to simply identify things and then throw a medication at it, identify a surgical indication, and then go to the operating room. And there's a role for that. There is a role for acute care, and you need to memorize things that you need to know for bedside care. But why are we forcing them to memorize the names of every nerve in the finger, when instead we could teach them where the nerves run and the basic principles that are clinically relevant? We know 99.9% of the students where we teach them the names of all 5 nerves in each finger, they're going to forget it. They're going to forget it. So what are we doing? We need to start teaching the non-technical skills, not just the technical skills, but the non-technical skills.
You talk about nerves, and what I'm about to ask you about is not about nerves, but it came to mind because of the picture you have in the book. It's a drawing of fallopian tubes surrounding an ovary. And the reason I bring this up is you say in a chapter in your book that this theory, and I've had friends that have had this done, taken both ovaries out, removed both breasts because they have a 70% chance of getting cancer, and you don't think this is a good idea.
So new research is showing that the most common and lethal form of ovarian cancer does not come from the ovary. It comes from the fallopian tube next to the ovary. And so modern medicine has taken out millions of normal, healthy ovaries in the name of ovarian cancer prevention. But this new research discovery suggests that we have been targeting the wrong organ. And so now there's a new practice, it's standard of care, that if at many medical centers, and it's recognized by the National OBGYN Association, that removing the fallopian tube when doctors are in the abdomen for another reason at the time of surgery, removing the fallopian tube can significantly reduce a woman's 1 in 78 chance of developing ovarian cancer in the future, leaving the ovary in place. The ovaries produce important hormones. And so this is a new practice now when people come in to Johns Hopkins and say, I'd like my tubes tied because I'm done having children and I want permanent birth control. The doctors are saying, we don't do that anymore. We recommend removing the fallopian tube, leaving the ovary in place to reduce your 1 in 78 chance of ovarian cancer.
What changed that?
So a group of researchers had realized that the cancer cells that we call ovarian cancer don't look like they come from the ovaries, a group of pathologists. And one of them at the University of California, San Diego, took a bold step and wrote a brave article saying, we may have it all wrong. And then eventually other researchers took an interest in this. They took a lot of heat. People were saying, why are you looking into this crazy idea? And it turns out they genetically did map ovarian cancer to cells that originated from the fallopian tube.
Why did it take so long?
Because medical dogma looms large, and there in medicine are nudges for doctors not to look into certain things. Why are you looking into that? There's no NIH research grant for that. Why are you looking into that? It's very hard to get pharma to fund that research. Why are you looking into that? It sounds outlandish, or it's based on someone's crazy idea. So there are many forces that essentially encourage doctors to keep your head down, do your job, and just study what our predecessors studied and continue that legacy of small incremental benefits, small incremental discoveries. But if you zoom out for a second and look at $300 billion spent on cancer research each year, what are we getting for it? What's our return on investment? The top paper at our big cancer conference was simply showing that a chemotherapy that's been around for a long time applied to another cancer increased survival by a few months without any added cure rate. If that's our return on investment for $300 billion a year, we need fresh new ideas. We need to fund investigators who think big and are not doing these small incremental experiments.
Let me ask you about something I've noticed in going to doctors in recent years, and it has something to do with the internet, because you write about this in your book. But you go in and the doctor says you need a test. So you go get the test, and something is happening today, at least in my case, that never happened before. The test comes to my portal where I can read it before the doctor tells me anything about this. And I know you find it controversial about not being able to do some of the testing in your own homes.
Well, look, I believe in transparency. I don't think there's any society which has said, let's increase transparency of data, and then later said, this was a bad idea, let's keep data secret or controlled again. So I did advocate for home COVID testing in the pandemic, despite getting a lot of heat for it, being told, this was not going to work and you can't trust people. But we have a long history of medical paternalism. When home pregnancy tests were developed, doctors fought it. The medical establishment seemed to argue that women can't handle this information on their own. We have to give it to them in the hospital. Same thing with HIV testing. When HIV testing was developed, up until recently, you couldn't get the results yourself. You had to come into a doctor's office. There was a feeling that people can't handle this information. So I believe in transparency. Sadly, California just passed a law that says you can't just go on your electronic health record and check your test results until the doctor has reviewed them first. Again, a very doctor-centered, paternalistic approach. If your test result is back, why can't you see it?
Do liberals and conservatives, Democrats and Republicans, think differently about medicine?
I actually think there's a lot of agreement, but there's also partisanship that has entered the medical establishment. We saw that during COVID. It almost became a political badge to believe in vaccine mandates for young college students, even though the data never suggested that there was benefit for young, healthy people. The data were very clear on natural immunity, but it became a Democrat talking point that natural immunity was unreliable. Eventually, same with the Wuhan lab leak. I actually think it's a small group of partisans that are very loud, and that most Democrats, Republicans, and independents agree on so much in healthcare. We can all agree that corruption is wrong, and we should identify it and stop it. It's a big problem in healthcare. We can all agree that we love our nation's children more than we hate each other. And that has been now become a bit of a campaign slogan to try to unite the country around childhood chronic diseases. I consider myself politically independent, and I've been identified as a saint and a demon by both sides of the political aisle, depending on what I say. But I try to stick to the science, regardless if it's politically convenient or not. So I think there's a lot of agreement, and I hope we can unite around one of the biggest problems facing the United States right now, which is the high cost of healthcare that burdens every American business, that taxes every American through their paycheck deduction for health insurance and the Medicare excise tax. We spend more on healthcare, double than any other developed countries, and we have pathetic outcomes for a developed country. If you just look at the government, 50% of all federal spending goes to healthcare. And you might say, wait a minute, no, it's not that high, but it is that high. It's up to half of Social Security checks are used for healthcare expenses. The Defense Department has its own healthcare system. It's 15% of their budget. The VA is separate. It's about 6% of federal spending. And we pay for health benefits for 9.1 million federal workers and retirees. And when you add it up, including the spending on healthcare resulting in healthcare debt interest payments, we're at half of federal spending goes to healthcare. What are we going to do? Just keep going down this road as 2/3 of Americans have metabolic dysfunction and poor health and are increasingly taking medications? We've got to take a fresh, new approach. Maybe we need to treat more diabetes with cooking classes than just throwing insulin at people. Maybe we need to treat more high blood pressure by talking about sleep quality and stress management instead of just throwing antihypertensives at people. Maybe we need to talk about school lunch programs, not just putting every overweight child on Ozempic. We need to talk about environmental exposures that cause cancer, not just the chemo to treat it. We've got to talk about food and food as medicine and general body inflammation and the role of pesticides and toxins. This is the focus of a new group of doctors, including myself, that are saying we can't keep going down the path we're on. We've got to address these big issues that have lived in the blind spots of modern medicine.
Back to the politics just for a moment. You became at some point a medical spokesperson on Fox News. And my question to you is, what impact did it have on the way people treated you in the political world and even in the medical world once they saw you as a spokesperson on Fox?
Well, I was very grateful for the platform that Fox News offered me to explain our research at Johns Hopkins, the studies we put out. And at the time, my role was editor-in-chief of the second largest trade publication read by physicians called MedPage Today. And in that role, I felt like I needed to understand COVID really well, talk to doctors in Wuhan. And it was pretty clear to me that what was happening in Italy and China was going to happen in the United States. And in fact, there was already seeding and community transmission. So I was grateful for the opportunity to warn people and to talk about our research. But of course, given the polarization of society, people will just make assumptions based on a network that you go on. And of course, that is part of the problem in modern day society today. We don't do a good job listening, and we tend to listen to news that polarizes us and that affirms what we already believe. I had said things on Fox News that I think some people liked and some people didn't like, viewers and non-viewers. But I am grateful because when I agreed to go on Fox News, I had an understanding with the network that I could talk about whatever I wanted to talk about. There was no editorial control. And they actually said, we want you to say whatever you believe to be scientifically valid, and we are not going to encourage you in one direction or the other. And they stuck to that promise.
You say in the book you were responsible for a checklist for operating rooms.
Yeah, so patient safety was a big area in one of the blind spots of modern medicine. That is, people dying not from the disease that brought them to care, but from the care itself. And in the world of surgery, we were not doing a good job standardizing some of the best practices that were well known out there. And we were just starting operations without really good teamwork, without even understanding who's on the team, what are the names of the people in the room, how do we communicate effectively. We do a good job in medicine on technical skills. We don't do a good job on the non-technical skills, communication, coordinating care, being effective in how we get things done. So we developed a checklist similar to a checklist pilots use, presented it to the World Health Organization, where Atul Gawande chaired a committee. He liked the data and the early studies I had done at Johns Hopkins on the checklist with Peter Pronovost. And the WHO committee adopted the checklist, and it became known as the WHO surgical checklist. And to this day, it's still on the operating room walls of most hospitals in the world.
When you go to a doctor and he or she says you need an MRI, and you call up the hospital or the tech center and say, I need an MRI. And they say, we'll get back to you. And they get back to you and say, your insurance company won't approve this. This didn't used to happen. Why is it happening now?
Well, because healthcare costs have spun out of control. Insurance companies have resorted to doing sort of blanket rejections of certain tests and studies. It's driving doctors crazy. It's driving patients crazy. I think people have a right to say, how did we get here? But the underlying problem, this is a symptom of a bigger problem. The underlying problem is that we have a super expensive healthcare system and the most over-medicated generation in the history of the world. The best way to lower drug prices is to stop taking drugs we don't need. And right now we're seeing a lot of the fighting over the rules to sort of limit bad behavior in healthcare, but we need a bigger solution. On the tests that we order, we tend to order too many tests. There are two problems in clinical medicine: undertreatment and overtreatment. But by far, overtreatment dominates the healthcare system. We did a study on our research team asking doctors nationwide, what % of medical care is unnecessary in your opinion? The average answer was 21%. So in any industry where you have 1 in 5 services deemed unnecessary by people on the front lines, that's an industry in crisis.
Gatekeepers, medical journals. You say that you've written 250 articles for medical journals and that they have a lot of power to either accept or not accept your articles.
When people say, Marty, who is this old guard medical establishment you're talking about? It is the editors of the medical journals, the big medical journals that serve terms longer than European monarchs. They never leave these jobs. I think President Mugabe of Zimbabwe served a shorter term than some of these editors. And they flood the editorial board with their friends. It is a board that is determined mostly by cronyism. That's why the New England Journal of Medicine only had 1 out of 51 editors African-American just a couple years ago. And the problem is they're going to continue to ignore what's in the blind spots of modern medicine, all the issues that I talk about and write about in the book. So we need fresh, new ideas. We are not making progress. The country is getting sicker as healthcare is more and more expensive. We need fresh, new ideas.
What would you say, I assume you've even been there, if a doctor said to you, I want to put you on a trial, but in the trial, half of the people will get the real thing and the other half will get a non, whatever you call it, placebo.
Placebo.
What's your reaction to that? I mean, I've been there. I've seen it happen. And my reaction to it was, I'm not spending a year in some trial that at the end they say to you that you didn't get the medicine.
Well, the way we learn in clinical medicine is through good randomized control trials, but they have to be designed well. And the reality is less than 5% of cancer trials actually have a new medication that is better than standard of care. So one way that pharma companies have gamed this system is to include two drugs in the trial. The new drug versus an old ineffective drug, a drug that we know is suboptimal, a drug that we don't use currently for the majority of patients because it's no good. So by rigging the trial, making the comparison arm a drug that's not effective, you get results that may support the financial interests of that company. So people need to know what are the alternatives to participating in the trial and what's the early data on a new medication. My concern as a surgical oncologist is people are hungry for some kind of hope when they're given a cancer diagnosis. And when you give them sort of this false premise that a clinical trial could be the ultimate cure, when you don't tell them that less than 5% of these clinical trials actually yield a superior result than existing standard of care, you are essentially misleading. It's predatory, in my opinion.
We talked about this earlier, but I'd be interested in your reaction to, you have a patient and you've undoubtedly had a patient and you have to tell them they have pancreatic cancer. What do you tell them then?
Well, it's the most difficult part of my job is breaking bad news. It's something I was never prepared to do in medical school. It's something I'm better at, but I'm still not perfect. And what I've learned is you have to try hard to get to know them first so you're not walking in cold. Try to figure out, are they the sort of person that wants to know all the science in detail? Or are they the sort of person that is just okay with it and has already accepted that we are all mortal? Some patients tell me they want to know every little detail, and other patients immediately will say, well, doctor, thank you for being honest and straightforward with me because I don't sugarcoat things. And I really appreciate it. And I'm going to go and achieve some of the things in life I've always wanted to do. Sometimes we take it harder than the patients because some people are so prepared. They understand, they're in tune with their mortality. But it is a difficult time, and there's different stages of accepting and grieving the news. And we want to swing for the fence and swing for a cure if it's possible, if a patient is motivated, if they're driven. But if not, we need to tailor the care and the recommendations to what their individual goals are.
So what's the prognosis these days on that kind of cancer? How long do people live on average?
So less than 20% of people make it to 5 years, and probably a slightly smaller percentage actually are cured. We can cure some people with pancreatic cancer in early stages, stage 1 and some stage 2 patients. On rare occasion, we've seen some cures of stage 3, and we will offer some aggressive therapies to people who are young and motivated to try them. But in general, we don't do a good job of recognizing that there's not a lot we can do. We tend to do probably too many procedures, put too many patients on chemo as a profession, radiate too many patients. When this is a cancer that has a dismal prognosis, I sometimes will offer patients a short trial of chemotherapy and see if the tumor happens to be one of the subtypes that responds well to chemo. And if we see a shrinkage, that may be a sign to keep going with the chemo if the person's tolerating it well. But if not, maybe that's a time that we should recommend pulling back on all the medical interventions.
All right, this is, I know you're not expecting this question, and maybe I shouldn't even ask it, but because it's so public, when you hear about Princess Catherine has abdominal cancer and takes 9 months of chemotherapy, and they won't tell their public what kind of cancer she has, what's your guess?
I don't know. I've thought maybe an appendiceal cancer or some other GI malignancy, but I think it's probably anyone's guess.
I mean, if it's abdominal, I assume it could be pancreatic.
Yeah, I mean, there's some things that are not very consistent with pancreatic cancer. You never know if the 9 months of chemotherapy is the standard course, or maybe they gave her extra chemotherapy. VIPs in general tend not to get great care because they can control their care sometimes, or they'll find a doctor that'll do it the way they want. That was probably the case with Steve Jobs. His story is public, even though he came to Johns Hopkins. And many people may know that he was very much in control of his care and denied or refused to undergo some of the recommended care that he could have had.
When does somebody like you have time to write a book? And this is what at least your third book.
Well, this is my passion. I love writing and I love interviewing doctors. So in writing the book Blind Spots, I found doctors who were at the top of their game. They were the world experts on the microbiome and GYN cancer and food allergies and the low-fat diet and heart disease. And I would ask them, what is the latest scientific research in your field? And what do people not know that they should know? And I thought maybe I would find a couple interesting facts. But in fact, all of these experts would unload and tell me this incredible new body of scientific research on everything from pesticides to refined carbohydrates. And so I felt a duty to use my platform to educate the public. A lot of us now in medicine are recognizing we're working in a broken system, and we're going directly to the public to educate them on the truth about some of the misinformation about food and allergy prevention, hormone therapy in postmenopausal women, so that they can experience the health benefits.
There's an item in your book that stopped me, and that was you had joined an association, a medical association, and had only 2 COVID tests, and they wouldn't let you come to a meeting unless you had 3. Explain that one.
This is one of the most prestigious medical associations in the world, the National Academy of Medicine. We have roughly 1 to 3 people inducted into this society at Johns Hopkins each year. I was privileged to be inducted, but then I couldn't go to the national meeting because they required a COVID vaccine booster. As someone young and healthy who already had COVID, it was very clear to me that I did not need the COVID vaccine booster. I chose not to get it, and for that reason, I was not admitted to this big national conference. How can you have public discourse when you censor physicians on social media and don't allow them to participate at conferences? So it was very disappointing, but I don't blame individual doctors. I blame the groupthink. The bandwagon effect is a powerful force. And when in medicine, when we simply participate in the herd mentality, we forget about our duty to challenge deeply held assumptions in medicine.
Who's been the maddest at you in your career?
I don't know. I think I've had good relationships with so many of the people I've disagreed with. They've really not wanted to have a public discussion around some of the topics. I think the American Hospital Association is very upset at the work that my team has done, bringing attention to price gouging by hospitals and predatory billing. We've encouraged patients never to sign any financial documents in an emergency room. It is predatory, and hospitals are required by law to take care of you for any urgent or emergent situation, no matter what hospital you walk into, no matter what your faith or skin color or your financial situation. So we tried hard to educate people that these forms in hospitals that you're expected to sign your life, home, mortgage, savings, retirement away in perpetuity under penalty of law, these forms are unethical, and you don't need to sign them. And if they force you to in order to get care because some receptionist is telling you you have to sign it, go ahead and sign it. Did not read, or this is not a contract.
Dr. Makary, one last question regarding what's going on in this country now. We keep hearing that the booster shot is out for COVID. What would you advise people when they hear that? Should they run to the drugstore and get a COVID booster?
Well, Pfizer and Moderna made billions of dollars during COVID. They can afford to do a randomized controlled trial. There was plenty of time. COVID's been around all summer, but they've chosen not to do a clinical trial to show whether or not it's effective. And so with the regulatory capture that they have, with the cozy relationship that they have with the FDA and the Department of Health and Human Services, they've chose to bypass that normal process that educates us as physicians as to what to recommend to individual patients. The American public has said no, thank you. The vast majority of Americans under the age of 50 are saying no to the COVID booster. And I don't blame them. I think it may be limited in its indication for high-risk individuals. There's a concern about a multiple booster strategy. One study found it may increase susceptibility, the same way that introducing a little bit of allergen can reverse an allergy that someone has. So I, on a much bigger scale, wish that we would return to basic scientific principles and get away from these ways in which companies bypass the system to push a medication on the American public.
The book is called Blind Spots, When Medicine Gets It Wrong and What It Means for Our Health. And our guest for the last hour has been Dr. Marty Makary. He's at Johns Hopkins, and we thank you for your time.
Thanks so much, Brian.
Thanks for listening to the Booknotes Plus podcast. Please rate and review Booknotes Plus, and don't forget to follow so you never miss an episode. Questions or comments, we would love to hear from you. You can email us at podcasts@c-span.org.